reason that the Vietnam War started was after Vietnam won their independence from France, the North and South had different opinions on government. The North wanted an all-communist government, and the South did not. That caused the North Vietnamese to invade the South by using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was named after the leader of the Vietnamese. The South did not have a leading role like the North did with Ho Chi Minh. But after the North invaded the South immediately started fighting the war against the North. The North then fought for communism and the South for liberty. The Vietnam War was basically the Civil War of Vietnam with extra help from the United States. That is how the Vietnam War started.
Okay, so what do you think about the North Vietnam's government?
Well, at the time, the North Vietnam government wasn't really in our thoughts because they hadn't invaded at the time. We had no idea that the North Vietnamese were going to invade the South. So I really didn't think that much about the North Vietnamese because they really weren't involved. It was just in South Vietnam, and they obviously were sending guerrillas down there to do the fighting. But to answer your question, I just didn't really think that much about them until after they invaded and I was home.
Okay.
I don't know if that came out.
The U.S. fought in the Vietnam War because the country was afraid and against communism. The U.S. had a theory that if Vietnam became a communist country, the rest of Southern Asia would too. This is called the domino theory. The U.S. then started sending troops to support the South Vietnamese army to train them. Eventually, we joined the war when the North Vietnamese bombed our ship, the USS Maddox, in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was the spark that led the U.S. to join the war. Then, throughout the war, the U.S. played a large role in helping the South Vietnamese. The U.S. sent over 500,000 troops to Vietnam. We even had the war won because of our great war tactics after we found out what the North was doing. The North signed a treaty with the South saying they had lost to the U.S. and the South Vietnamese. Then the U.S. left Vietnam and we had stopped supporting the war. After President Nixon resigned, the North easily beat the South after the U.S. had left and stopped funding the war overall. The U.S. played the largest role in the Vietnam War, from having it won to losing it.
The U.S. had a great Air Force during the Vietnam War. They were highly skilled, but lost some missions, but won some too. The U.S. trained the South Vietnamese Air Force. The U.S. Air Force overall played a major impact on the war, and without it, the South would lose pretty quickly. The U.S. used many variations of helicopters and planes, and because of our advanced technology, the North didn't have much of a fighting chance. What were the rules for the different planes in the Vietnam War?
Well, I don't have all of them here on display, but we start on this C-124 Glowmaster, which at the time was the biggest transport, I think, in the world. You might see the propeller-driven 747, and they were support. They would fly supplies in country. They really weren't involved in the war as such, but a vital part of the operation is getting supplies in. So airplanes like the C-124, which I flew before I flew the B-26, were vital. And then there were actually three major attack airplanes. The A-1 Skyraider I don't have anything picture of. This T-28 is actually a trainer model of the airplane that was used as a fighter. They were a bigger, more powerful version with wing stations. They would put gun pods on the wing stations, or they could carry bombs. And they usually worked in pairs of three. They were like 120 degrees apart, coming in on a target. So they always had guns on the target. But airplane I flew was the B-26 Invader. It's a World War II airplane brought out of the boneyards for Vietnam, because in Vietnam they didn't really have a good airplane for that type of war. So they were back to what we were called the Air Commandos, which was an offshoot of World War II. And they were these also flew in Korea. The French flew them, and we would normally carry 6 cans of napalm on the wings. And the nose guns, we had 6 or 8 50 caliber machine guns. And in the bomb bays, we would carry 12 bombs, generally 6 100-pound general purpose bombs and 620-pound, they call them fragmentation clusters. The bombs would drop and then it would spread apart, and all these little bomblets would be deposited on target. And we did strafing, obviously the machine guns, and the dive bombing with the bombs, and then napalm runs you about 50 feet off the ground, zipping on in. Then there were other important support aircraft in country called C-47s or DC-3s that did a lot of cargo work and psychological warfare work with speakers and throwing out flares when you did night missions. And there were C-123 providers, and there were another twin-engine cargo plane, and there was a light plane called a U-10 that would short takeoff and land and did psychological warfare. And that's a quick overview of the planes used. The Vietnamese were mainly the ones flying the Sky Raiders.
The North Vietnamese, our enemy, had an overall mediocre air force, but they were better and trained to a higher quality than the South. One type of plane the North Vietnamese had was the MiG-21 fighters. Their pilots were unskilled and their technology was a lot worse than ours, so they did not have as advanced aircraft. South Vietnamese pilots were unskilled and didn't know how to fly very well, which is another reason why the U.S. came into the war. The air game in the Vietnam War was huge, and it is why the U.S. helped the South Vietnamese pilots so they could train them. They eventually became somewhat skilled and could fight with the North Vietnamese, so the South wasn't as skilled at dogfighting, but with help from the U.S., they eventually became pretty good flyers. Operation Farmgate was an operation where the U.S. Air Force had to train the South Vietnamese Air Force with old World War II aircraft. This was good because it helped South Vietnam pull its own weight and made more missions more successful with the extra pilots. Okay, what did you do in the Vietnam War?
Well, I was a pilot in Vietnam War in an operation called Farmgate. And I probably should give you a little background on that, in that back in 1960, the Russian President Khrushchev said he was going to support wars of liberation, in other words, communist uprisings in all parts of the world. And the United States got a little concerned about that because the Viet Cong, known as the VC, were starting to get pretty aggressive in South Vietnam. At the time, North Vietnam had not invaded, and so President Kennedy at the time said he wanted a study made what they could do to counter this, and the consensus was that the United States needed to send in advisors to help the Vietnamese Army and Air Force and so forth, and the code name was Jungle Jim, but my particular aspect, I got there in 1963, was Operation Farmgate. Why Farmgate, I have no idea, but the military has its reasons. The guise was that we were going to advise the Vietnamese troops. Supposedly I was going over as a instructor pilot, but you probably can't tell from the video, but this airplane I flew, the V-26, has Vietnamese markings on it, which is basically the same as the U.S. marking, but a different color. And the cover story was that it was a classified operation, that we were just training pilots. We actually had a Vietnamese on the airplane, but Vietnamese was just there for, you might say, body count. If you crash, they could say, here's a student. But actually, in my particular airplane, was a pilot, a navigator, and behind the navigator sat the Vietnamese, supposedly student, but he was strictly there for political reasons because we weren't supposed to be fighting, but in actuality we performed in many missions. We'll get to that later on, but the whole thing started with the fear of the communists taking over all these different countries, and we were sent to help. That's pretty much it for that part of your question. I don't know if I answered your question exactly.
Okay. What role did you play in Operation Farmgate?
Operation Farmgate, as I mentioned previously, was just the cover for the operation, and I did basically close air support missions, such as one of the bigger and more important missions was Hamlet defense at night. The Vietnamese set up these safe little forts, and they would often get attacked at night. And so when the forts were attacked, we get called in to break up the attack. And they had what they called a fire arrow on the ground. It was this arrow was either burning oil cans or flares or whatever that pointed in the direction of the enemy. And they'd say hit 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters into in the direction of the fire arrow. And so then I'd start with diving down and doing a short strafing run and say, is that where you want it? And then when they corrected where they wanted the fire, then I would lay napalm. And then when I got the enemy far enough away from the fort, I'd start stringing bombs. And there were such missions as escorting helicopters to landing zones. The helicopters would zigzag under helicopters, and when they get to a landing zone for an operation, I'd zip ahead and beat up the edges of the landing zone with napalm, machine guns, bombs, and then the helicopters would land. Other missions were we called them splinter missions. We didn't know exactly what was under the jungle, but the forward air controller. I should tell you that no strikes were made unless you had the direct, okay from a forward air controller. You need to throw a smoke grenade out the window and say hit the smoke. Or later on, they fired White phosphorus rockets, and it just tell you where to strike. The jungle is maybe 200 feet high and dropped all kinds of stuff, bombs, napalm, and had no idea what was underneath it. And one of the more fun missions was escorting trains. The trains were never attacked when we were escorting them, and it was just a lot of fun to buzz a train as you're going along. So we had fun doing stuff like that. I could go on with some of the other ones, but you probably have a time constraint here, so I'll let you go.
How did the Vietnam War impact you?
Really not all that much. I did my duty, so to speak, and at the time I thought I was doing the right thing. And I just went on with life. I had a family, went with the airlines, and so the war did not really impact me that much, except being there was actually quite satisfying. But afterwards, the war was just not part of my psyche.
Yeah, do you think that the war impacted anyone around you?
Well, the people that lost their husbands certainly impacted them. We had people that didn't come home, on their own feet. So yes, there was certainly a very serious impact. You could very well have not been here if something went a little different over there.
Yeah. How do you think the war impacted America?
Well, it was a pretty terrible impact. I guess it's pretty much known as the national nightmare because the guys were dying. Over 55,000 or so died. So that created deep divisions in America. And there was, at the time when the protests first started, I was really against the protests. But then later on, in retrospect, the protesters probably had a pretty valid point, and it left a scar on society, which remains today.
The war affected the U.S. in many ways, such as making it to Hollywood with Forrest Gump, to ruining families because of relatives dying. Overall, the reaction of the Vietnam War was not positive. A lot of the U.S. didn't want troops in Vietnam, saying that it was a rich man's war, as well as them just wanting their family members home and not fighting in what, at the time, seemed like a useless war. It seemed like almost everyone wanted troops out of Vietnam. They protested with signs saying, "Get the hell out of Vietnam," or "I want my family back." Even the troops wanted to go home, putting protest on weaponry. I guess you could say that the Vietnam was one of the most hated wars in American history. However, the war does not have a long-lasting impression on the U.S., but when it was happening, the government was spending a lot of money on the war, saying that it was a large cause. However, the entire rest of the country thought it was pointless, as well as most of the veterans. The war did affect the U.S. in many ways.